Keep listening for this just in from Outdoors environmental news from the Monterey Bay, only on KZSC, Santa Cruz. KZSC.
Now, young fellas, been having a lot of fun around here today, haven't you? You know what makes this all possible? The forests around us. We should all be thankful for our forests.
You're tuned into This Just In from Outdoors. Stick around for news about Indigenous leadership in preparing communities for the increasing effects of climate change, and an interview about how the media has a blind spot when it comes to covering the environmental impacts of eating animals. Plus headlines and more. Stick around.
This just in from Outdoors.
Improving energy efficiency not only helps prevent global warming pollution, it can lower utility bills and provide much-needed savings for low-income people. Elevate Energy is a Chicago-based nonprofit that helps make affordable housing developments more energy efficient. The organization conducts free energy audits, helps with retrofits such as replacing light fixtures or updating heating systems, and connects building owners with funding for the improvements. For example, the group helped Lucha, Chicago's Latin United Community Housing Association, conduct energy audits and lighting retrofits. Juan Carlos Linares, executive director of Lucha, said that improving energy efficiency can help make housing affordable for low-income tenants, who sometimes spend as much as 20% of their incomes on energy.
This is money they can use to pay for their healthcare costs. They can pay for educational costs. Lots of our tenants want to get back to college. They tell us this. Or for anything else in terms of transportation, getting to work, or cost of living issues. So we're seeing a holistic change, not just at Lucha, but with our communities generally speaking.
Over the last decade, Elevate Energy has retrofitted more than 20,000 units of affordable multifamily housing around the city.
Pregnant women may want to move away from neighborhoods located close to fracked gas wells, according to a Princeton University study that finds a higher rate of low birth weight babies near the wells. The researchers compared the locations of parents' homes to hospital records in Pennsylvania and found a strong correlation. Study author Janet Curry, an economics professor at Princeton, says that the low birth weights were clustered and much more likely to be right next to the well sites.
What is surprising is we found a fairly large effect for people living very close, but by the time you got to 2 miles away, we did not detect any effect.
According to the Center for Biological Diversity, fracking has been documented in 10 counties: Colusa, Glenn, Kern, Los Angeles, Monterey, Sacramento, Santa Barbara, Sutter, Kings, and Ventura. It also takes place in some of the offshore wells near the coast, from the Santa Barbara Channel to Seal Beach. Industry reps argue that air pollution from gas wells and compressor stations disperses quickly, and they say they comply with all regulations. Multiple studies have linked low birth weight to health issues down the road. Curry says previous research points to culprits such as benzene, a volatile organic compound used in fracking fluid that has been linked to leukemia and blood disorders by the National Cancer Institute. Beth Weinberger with the Environmental Health Project says benzene and soot particles in diesel exhaust are common in the gas fields and have been associated with preterm births in other studies.
We know much of what's in the emissions, and in each of the studies, the researchers have found associations between exposure to gas drilling and birth outcomes.
The Princeton research suggests keeping drilling away from homes through zoning or well setback rules. Weinberger adds that even a portable air filter may help some homes reduce pollution levels.
For centuries, Native Americans have relied on natural resources to sustain their families, communities, and traditional ways of life and cultural identities. This relationship with both land and water makes Indigenous peoples and cultures particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. April Taylor is a sustainability scientist with the Chickasaw Nation, who works at the South Central Climate Science Center in Norman, Oklahoma. Taylor assists 68 tribes across New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana to manage and plan for the many environmental impacts of climate change, including issues such as tribal water rights, sea level rise, flooding, droughts, and wildfires. She was interviewed by Melinda Tuhus for Between the Lines Radio News Magazine.
The way I explain my job is I do three things. One, I'm a matchmaker. So I am out engaged with tribal staff of various types, and I matchmake them with climate scientists and researchers to work together on projects and go after funding to plan for the impacts they're seeing in their communities already for climate change and what they might see in the future. The second aspect is we do trainings. We build tribal capacity. We've done 32 trainings in the last 4.5 years, and they're on all sorts of things, including grant writing, data and tools, and how to find the right information and resources to developing the plans for their communities. And then the third aspect is we do youth outreach, so promoting Native students in STEM fields, creating our next generation of tribal staff.
You mentioned, I think, 4 states that you cover, and some of them I know have had huge climate impacts, including, what is being described as the first U.S. climate refugees, a small tribe in Louisiana.
I just wrote a piece for the National Climate Assessment on the Louisiana tribes. We've done quite a bit of trainings and networking down in Louisiana. It's really interesting to see them doing this relocation in their own way. They're moving their entire community. It's really cool to see that they want to do that, and it's sort of bringing them closer together. A lot of those communities, they've lived on the coast for a very long time and were forced out to those areas.
This is Ile de Saint Charles. Did I get that right?
Charles, yeah. Okay. But there are other communities out there as well. There's Point Ishane. Chittimaca is out there as well. Chittimaca is really leading the way in the scientific aspect and mapping out their sea level rise and making their plans. Huma tribe is out there as well, the Huma Nation, and they're very active and aware of climate change. And then we have the Coushatta tribe. They're going to be impacted as well, even though they're very far up on the mainland right now. I work with more of the scientist or planners type of people. It's not uncommon that we get, especially in those communities that are being impacted now, that you get leadership involved. Our last training was in May, and it's really interesting. I mean, you get community members, you get Native church people that come in for these trainings because they're interested. They want to know what's happening and what are they dealing with.
Is it mostly sea level rise and flooding? Are there other issues related to climate change that you're seeing in the tribes you work with?
Drought. Several of the tribes are doing drought planning. Wind River just finished theirs. Chickasaw Nation is waiting for the final approval to finish ours. And they're really leading the way and taking the leads before the states and before what's required. They're not required to do drought planning, but they're doing these things. Wildfires is another huge one. Loss of water resources and tribal water rights is a big one. So we're not seeing the stream flows or the snow melt, these communities are seeing these changes. We're seeing changes in species and how species are being in cultural significant species and how they're changing already. And so some of these species that they rely on, what's happening is what we call, and there's an Indigenous phenology network. And phenology is basically the timing of the seasons and when things change. And so they're seeing some of those changes happening, months earlier. And so they're trying to figure out what that means for their culture, for the communities. Do we change the ceremony and things like that? For my tribe, we have a butterfly restoration project as well. So there are 7 tribes doing butterfly restoration, trying to help the species adapt.
One of the scientists leading efforts to redirect Canadian national policy on climate change is Irena Creed, a professor in the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Saskatchewan. Here, she describes the social justice roots of the policy recommendation process and some of the specifics about how Canada, if it shifts to a low-carbon energy model, could address some of the inequalities created or worsened by climate change, especially for Indigenous communities of the far Arctic North.
Today I want to speak about what's happening, some of the late-breaking developments in Canada. And we have a very strong female leader in climate change, Dr. Catherine Pauvin from McGill University. And under her leadership as a UNESCO Chair for Dialogues on Sustainability, she led over 90 academics from across the country to come together at a time when our country, we were very concerned about our political leadership, and we wanted to raise ambitions of Canada's policy on climate change. The outcome of this effort is a report called Acting on Climate Change Solutions from Canadian Scholars. And the overwhelming outcome of this consensus of this report was that Canada needs to make a shift from an oil-producing country to a renewable energy leader. And furthermore, this plan has to be for all Canadians, not just the average Canadian. We need to integrate social and environmental justice in the low-carbon transition. As we transition and meet these important targets, we need to ask the question, is there a risk that we will further disadvantage some of the marginalized communities in our countries? In particular, in Canada, we're a very large country, and here I've mapped out the circumpolar north, everything above 50 degrees latitude. There's not a lot of people living there in Canada. Many of them live off the power grid, and so they're at risk. And when we look at this, they're not large emitters of greenhouse gases, and they often use diesel, and because it's cheap, it's flexible, they can store it. So the question is, why should they too have to change? And the reason is because it's not about what their contribution is to CO2 in the global context, but they are also ones that are at high risk of the consequences of climate change. We talk about climigration. Should we stay or should we go? This region is going to be faced with reduced ice cover, degrading permafrost, rising sea levels and increased coastal erosion, reduced reliability of ice roads, and also ecosystem shifts and species shifts that are going to affect their food supplies. When we look at some of the conditions in which they live, you can see some of the housing inside. You have the diesel, which sometimes when the roads are starting to go, they're not going to have energy supply. There's definitely a link between energy insecurity and food and water risks. In many of the Indigenous communities in Canada, they have boil water advisories. They can't drink the water unless it's boiled. They have very expensive food. And so the question is, they contribute among the least to climate change, but they're among the most vulnerable to climate change. And in Canada, with the Truth and Reconciliation, which basically means that we have to come to terms with our past and our relationship with the Indigenous peoples, and we want to work towards establishing a respectful and healthy relationship with them moving forward, one has to ask the question, is this an opportunity? Can the energy transition to a low-carbon future be one of the greatest pathways for reconciliation with these Indigenous communities? So we seek to reimagine energy security for circumpolar North communities by creating and designing social and technological innovations for renewable energy systems that will enhance the livelihoods of the people living there. By accelerating this transition to low carbon in the circumpolar North, we can bring energy security, which will also alleviate some of the food and water risks. We can empower the communities. They can become autonomous as well as self-determine their futures. We can generate sustainable wealth. And here in the photo, you can see some of the First Nations Power Authority based in Saskatchewan as a real powerhouse, excuse the pun, in terms of moving forward. We have spin-off opportunities in creating other jobs related to energy, become part of a community where successes and failures can be shared. And finally, we can also become global leaders in transferring some of these models across to other parts of the world where marginalized communities exist. We're excited in Canada. We're hopeful in Canada. We believe solutions are possible. We need to embrace multiple different pathways. We need to learn by doing and share our experiences. And finally, we need to integrate the social and environmental justice in our transition.
A procession of clergy, singers, and swimmers crossed the Rio Del Mar Beach this past Saturday, January the 8th, to begin the Orthodox Christian service of the Blessing of the Waters. Present were about 150 people, including Orthodox clergy and their parishioners from churches in Boulder Creek, Saratoga, Monterey, Carmel, Concord, San Jose, and San Francisco. For 6 years now, the service has been led by the Reverend Dr. Meultin Janic, parish priest at the Prophet Elias Greek Orthodox Church in Santa Cruz. But the pan-Orthodox service was launched decades ago, as Father Meultin explains.
The parish of Prophet Elias in Santa Cruz established this celebration many decades ago with the Father John Karastamatis of blessed memory.
January 6th is the Greek Orthodox feast of Theophany, also called Epiphany. It is a celebration of the baptism in the Jordan River of Jesus of Nazareth.
And as we know from the history of the church, that Theophany actually was the original, if I can say, Christmas, because the focus was mostly then at the beginning of Christianity in the first church on two big feast days. Obviously, one is Pascha and the other was Theophany. And in Theophany, the church celebrated together Nativity of Christ, his circumcision, and his baptism.
The service is an occasion for Orthodox parishioners to reflect on the nature of water in the story of creation, and on the meaning of their own baptism and the lessons and wisdom that they can gain by reflecting on the baptism of Jesus.
The water itself has the meaning of life-giving water and so on. We cannot sustain without water, etc. And how the water is the way of cleaning and so on. The whole idea of God's providence to create, this beautiful creation, the beautiful earth, and then how the creation was in union with God through Adam and Eve, who are called the stewards of the creation, that they have to procreate, they have to beautify, and they have to take care of the creation, and only through them the creation is actually fully participating in a union with God. Obviously, God provides the sustainability of this beautiful creation.
At that time, Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan.
After prayers and the blessing of a bowl of water, clergy dipped bundles of fragrant herbs in the bowl and broadcast the water in the air to land on all those gathered for the ceremony. Then the remaining water was joined to the Pacific Ocean.
Who is spirit of the drought? Okay, all swimmers, can I get swimmers here? Swimmers, come here closer.
More than a dozen mostly young parishioners, some in wetsuits, then prepared to swim out to just beyond the waves breaking on Rio Del Mar Beach. There, a wooden cross had been placed for the swimmers to dive for. It only took 1 minute for Jacob Aldridge, a parishioner at St. Peter and Paul in Ben Lomond, to find the cross. Retired clergy John Takahashi provided further reflection on the service, and also on the icon of Theophany's depiction of the baptism of Jesus.
What does it mean that Christ stood in the midst of Jordan and blessed the water and the Holy Trinity was manifested? This is about our life. Our life is a river, stream, constantly running. And some of us get confused because of the movement constantly washing us with gossips, bad news, good news, and a lot of things happening to us. And all these things are constantly running and washing us. And we are in the midst of that movement. And we remember that Christ our Lord stood firm in the midst of the stream of life. And he stood, and what did he? Look at the icon of Epiphany. Look at him, how he stands in the midst of River Jordan with a blessing hand. That means we have to be able to stand in the midst of our life with a blessing hand. Whatever happens, we do not curse. Life is to celebrate. Life is not to curse. And celebrate what is given to us. This is the true mystery. Stand firm in the midst of our life and learn to bless. Bless this whole world God giving us every day. Amen. Amen.
This is the last pan-Orthodox Blessing of the Waters service to be led by Father Meultin, whose family is relocating to Sweden. Since the event is held in January every year, he is wondering what it'll be like to observe a Blessing of the Waters service on the frozen Fyris River or on a lake near Uppsala. Another Blessing of the Waters service will be held in San Francisco this weekend at Aquatic Park Cove near Ghirardelli Square. The event is Sunday, January 16th at 1:30 p.m. A festival with music and food organized by the United Hellenic American Societies, representing the Greek American community in California, starts at noon and continues to 4 p.m. Next, we'll hear from Roni Neff. Roni directs the program on food systems sustainability and public health at the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future. She was involved in a research study that looked at the coverage, or almost total lack thereof in U.S. newspapers, of agricultural impacts on climate change, especially animal agriculture. She spoke to Melinda Tuhus of Between the Lines radio news magazine.
So this was published in 2009, and it was soon after the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization had come out with its report, Livestock's Long Shadow, which found that 18% of global greenhouse gas emissions were attributable to livestock alone. And they've since revised that to 14.5%, but whatever. It's still incredibly high, and so we wanted to see, how come we're not hearing about that? Is that just my imagination, or is it real? And so we looked at, I believe it's 16 different major publications over a long period of time, and we found basically that 0.5% of the articles that address climate change mentioned anything to do with livestock.
And is this in the U.S. or globally?
This was U.S. newspapers.
Do you attribute that to anything in particular, or did you draw any conclusions, or do you have any ideas about why that's true?
Yeah, I think it's how we've been thinking about climate change from the very beginning has really been about carbon dioxide. And so it's a kind of a leap to start thinking about some of the other greenhouse gases that are very powerful, but they're released in much smaller amounts. So I think that some of the experts and leaders who have started the field of working on climate change weren't thinking as much about food and agriculture, and it's just kind of self-perpetuated. I worked closely with Linnea Lastadia, someone who's now a professor when she was a doctoral student, and she wanted to understand why non-governmental organizations weren't talking about this, even when they worked on climate change, or they worked on food, or they worked on animal welfare. But they weren't putting those pieces together to talk about the impacts of food on climate change. So those were some of the things that we found, and we also found that there's an issue where the staff themselves, we have such strong feelings in this country about what we eat. People themselves maybe weren't ready to make those changes. And she also found that they were concerned about what their donors would think, because maybe those donors also like their meat. Many of these organizations, these advocacy organizations, consider their domain to be policy work. And they said, well, food, that's individual. And they didn't really see that there could be policy or big picture or systemic types of work that they could do to address what we eat. So, and that's a challenge throughout working on food, is that everybody sees it as just somebody wagging their finger at them, telling them what to eat, as opposed to looking at the system.
If people who eat meat knew that there are better and better meat substitutes that don't involve animals at all, do you think that that is a viable way to move more people off of animal protein?
There's a lot of different types of approaches that can be helpful, and so if there are meat substitutes that are palatable, that are also low in greenhouse gas emissions and also taste good and affordable, that can be a win-win. Those pieces don't always go together as much as we might hope, but that could be a goal. Many people say that they don't know how to cook vegetarian meals, or they think, we've done some survey research, people just think, well, those meals are boring. And also, there's a lot of people that think that a meal is not healthy if it doesn't have meat in it.
I'm making a face when you said people think vegetarian meals are boring, because I think, the meat and potatoes with, canned green beans or whatever that a lot of us grew up on is really boring. And I think vegetarian food is just phenomenally creative and delicious.
I'm with you, and I think that there's just this renaissance of people creating interesting recipes and really finding ways to bring out the flavors of the foods. Anybody that's interested can look on the internet. You'll find a lot of really appealing recipes.
In terms of talking about systems as opposed to individual choices, what would you like our listeners to take away?
I think the first thing to know is how incredibly large of a footprint animal agriculture has compared to, and particularly beef production, compared to any other food, and even compared to the overall set of things that are emitting greenhouse gas emissions, like agriculture has a higher footprint than transportation. So that's number one. Number two is that there's so much that we can do, whether it's finding ways to eat more appealing vegetarian meals, whether it's looking at reducing the amount of food that we waste, because we waste 40% of our food supply in the United States. There's a lot that we can do.
Thanks for tuning in to This Just In From Outdoors. Check out our stories and past shows online at newsfromoutdoors.org. I've been your host, Keith Rozendal. Our headlines were produced by myself, Suzanne Potter of the California News Service, Bob Hirschhorn of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and Dr. Anthony Lazarowitz of the Yale Center for Environmental Communications. Irena Creed was recorded at the 2017 fall meeting of the American Geophysical Union in New Orleans, Louisiana. The piece was edited and produced by Keith Rozendal. The interviews with Roni Neff and April Taylor were produced by Melinda Tuhus of Between the Lines radio news magazine. You can follow them online at btlonline.org. Thanks again for listening. We'll be here next Friday at 5:30 p.m. for another edition. Until then, we'll see you outdoors.
Just bees and things and flowers. Just bees and things and flowers. Sunshine.
Now, young fellas, been having a lot of fun around here today, haven't you? You know what makes this all possible? The forest around us. We should all be thankful for our forest.
Just in from outdoors.
Please stay tuned for the Pacifica Evening News, which airs on KZSC Santa Cruz every night at 6 p.m.